was one of those mornings where everything feels too calm, too still, like the air itself is holding its breath. The sun rose lazy and golden over the small town of Magnolia Ridge, Mississippi. The kind of place where folks greet each other by name, where porches creak with old stories, and where secrets linger like the morning fog. 72-year-old Leonard Parker stood outside a neighbor's house, a wrench in one hand and a black toolbox open beside him. His denim overalls were faded, his army vet cap tilted just so on his graying head. He was adjusting the screws on Mrs. Harper's old rusted mailbox. She was widowed, sweet, and too frail to do it herself. And Leonard? He was the kind of man who didn't wait to be asked. He just showed up and helped. He'd lived on this street for 45 years, built his home with his own hands, watched kids grow up and move away, fought in Vietnam, came home quiet and never bragged about a damn thing. People just called him Mr. Parker. No titles, no frills, because everyone knew what he stood for. The morning hummed with normalcy. A lawnmower buzzed 2 houses down. Birds chirped from the trees that lined the curb. Then came the crunch of gravel and the sudden squeal of tires. 1 squad car, then 2 more. 3 county deputies rolled up hard. No sirens, just dust and arrogance. They parked at angles like they were cornering a suspect. Doors flung open. Out stepped 3 white officers, heavy boots, mirrored sunglasses, and that kind of walk that says, "We're not here to ask." The street, once still, now felt like a held breath, ready to snap. Leonard didn't flinch. He wiped sweat from his brow and stood slowly, posture straight, eyes steady. The first officer, tall, young, built like a linebacker, barked, "What are you doing out here?" Leonard replied without a hint of fear, "Fixing a mailbox. Mrs. Harper asked me yesterday." But they weren't really listening. The second officer leaned against the hood, arms crossed, smirking. "You live here?" Leonard pointed to the modest house across the street. "That's mine. Been mine since 1979. The third officer kicked at the toolbox with his boot, scattering wrenches onto the pavement. "Looks like theft to me. How do we know you didn't steal these?" Leonard's jaw tightened. "You can ask Mrs. Harper, or check property records. Or maybe just treat me like a man instead of a problem." That's when it shifted. The first cop moved in fast, grabbed Leonard's wrist, twisted it behind his back. "Don't resist, old man," he snarled. Leonard winced, not from pain, from the weight of déjà vu. His knees buckled as they shoved him to the ground. The tools clattered like gunshots across the concrete. Blood bloomed through his shirt from where his ribs struck the edge of the curb. Still, he said nothing. The cuffs snapped too tight, too fast. His old bones ground against metal. One officer chuckled, "Another vet who thinks he's above the law." They didn't ask for ID, didn't read his rights, didn't even pretend to verify anything. From the porch, Mrs. Harper peeked through the curtains, hand to her mouth. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Across the street, a neighbor's front door opened an inch, then quietly shut. No one stepped in. No one called out. The silence screamed louder than any siren could. The third officer leaned in close, his breath hot with cruelty. "Bet you think that flag on your porch still protects you. Newsflash, old man. It don't mean a damn thing out here." Leonard stared straight ahead, not at the officer, not at the cuffs, but at the stars and stripes flapping gently in the breeze above his porch. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't pride. It was grief. They shoved him into the back seat like he was garbage, slammed the door. The cruiser rolled away, the engine rumbling as dust swallowed the front yard where his tools still lay scattered. Inside the car, the radio played classic rock, the kind of song Leonard once danced to with his wife in their kitchen. The irony burned. The youngest officer glanced in the rear view and sneered. "People like you, always thinking you belong where you don't?" Leonard finally spoke, just once. "I bled for this country, for this town, and you don't get to erase that with handcuffs." The officer scoffed and turned the volume up louder. What they didn't know was that Leonard Parker wasn't alone. The name he whispered under his breath, soft enough for no one to hear, was more than a memory. Jackson, his only son. And Jackson Parker wasn't just any man. He was an elite intelligence operative, retired special forces, a man who'd seen the world's worst and survived. The kind of soldier who didn't need weapons to win wars, just a reason. And now he had one. The ride to the county station dragged on. Every bump in the road made the cuffs bite deeper. Every turn tightened the knot in Leonard's chest, not from fear, but from fury. They thought they were dealing with an old man. But they didn't know the storm they'd just awakened. And in the shadows of Magnolia Ridge, that storm was already gathering. The county station in Magnolia Ridge hadn't changed in decades. Same chipped paint on the walls, same humming fluorescent lights that flickered just enough to bother your eyes. The only thing that felt new was the weight of the injustice Leonard Parker carried as he was dragged through the double doors, wrists cuffed behind his back, head held high even as the bruises bloomed beneath his shirt. They didn't book him like a suspect, they processed him like a nuisance. Name, the desk sergeant mumbled between bites of a powdered donut. Before Leonard could answer, one of the arresting officers slapped his ID on the counter. Leonard Parker, claimed he lives on Pine Hollow Drive, tried to resist. Looks like an attempted theft, tools and mailbox parts. The sergeant barely glanced at the card. Veteran? Yeah, the officer snorted. He let us know. Leonard didn't speak. Not when they took his fingerprints, not when they dumped his belongings in a gray plastic bin, not even when one of them, accidentally, knocked over a cup of coffee onto his Army ID. He just stood still, jaw tight, eyes cold. They led him to a holding cell, a narrow box with rust stains on the wall and a bench cold enough to ache his bones. The cuffs finally came off, but the sting lingered. His wrists were raw, purpled, swelling. His shoulder throbbed. One eye felt like it might shut completely by morning. Still, he didn't lie down, didn't rest. He waited, because he knew what came next. They thought he was alone. They thought no one would come for an old black man with a limp and a history. But they didn't know about the burner phone taped under the sole of his boot, the one Jackson had given him years ago with 3 words, just in case. Now was the case. When the shift changed and the echo of boots disappeared down the hallway, Leonard leaned forward. Every movement felt like a protest, but he gritted through it. He reached under his boot, peeled the duct tape loose, and pulled out the slim black phone. Scratched screen. No contacts. 1 button. He pressed it. It rang once, then silence. "Dad?" The voice that answered was low, steady, and razor-sharp. It cut through the walls like a blade through fog. Leonard's throat felt thick. "Jackson, they came for me." "Where are you?" "Magnolia Ridge Precinct. Brought me in like I was a damned thief. Cuffed me, beat me, took everything but my dignity, and even that they tried." On the other end, there was no outburst, no panic, just a silence that braised like thunder behind clouds. "Are you hurt?" "I'll live," Leonard replied, "but I need you home." Jackson didn't ask who, what, or why. "I'm coming," he said. Then the line went dead. Leonard closed the phone and tucked it beneath the waistband of his pants. He leaned back, head against the cool cinder block wall, and let out the first deep breath he'd had since sunrise. He wasn't smiling. But the fire in his chest wasn't fear anymore, it was fuel. Because his son wasn't just someone. He was someone they'd never see coming. Jackson Parker had been flying under the radar since the day he left Special Forces. Delta veteran, intel operations, deep recon, the kind of man you only heard about in classified briefings and encrypted transmissions. He had no official address, no public number, just a shadow with muscle and a mind that never slept. And when that call came through, the mission changed. Within the hour, Jackson had rerouted from D.C., where he'd been running a contract for an intel firm. By the third hour, he'd hit Atlanta's private airstrip in a non-flagged jet, paid for in favors and firepower. By the sixth, he was behind the wheel of a rust-red Jeep, no tags, no questions, driving straight into the belly of the place that had tried to swallow his father whole. He didn't roll into town loud. That wasn't his way. He drove the back roads, keeping low, hood up. Parked 2 streets over from his childhood home, heart, a steel drum echoing in his chest. He walked past the cracked sidewalks where he'd once played baseball, past the grocery store that still had the same flickering open sign, and down to the house with the sagging porch light. He didn't stop. Not yet. Instead, Jackson circled to the back lot behind the station. The cameras hadn't moved since 2002. Same angles, same blind spots. He knew them like old scars. At 3:27 a.m., Jackson cut the wires behind the west maintenance door, slid inside, no weapon in hand, just a black duffel full of tech, tools, and the kind of gear that would make a Navy SEAL jealous. He wasn't there to break anyone out. He was there to build the noose. With truth. Inside a janitor's closet turned surveillance hub, Jackson tapped into the station's data core, downloaded booking files, internal chat logs, body cam footage. Most of it had already been tampered with. Redactions, edits, gaps. Amateurs. By 4:12 a.m. he had what he needed. Footage of Leonard getting cuffed on his own lawn, audio of the officer mocking him, and a glitch in the system. 12 seconds of deleted body cam that Jackson resurrected from the raw drive cache. It was enough. Enough to scorch the lie. He pulled out his phone, dialed one number. Upload package, he said, time-stamped, geo-locked, distribute to the 6 folders. On the other end, a voice said, "It's done." By dawn, it wouldn't just be Magnolia Ridge watching. It would be everyone. And when the world saw what they did to Leonard Parker, justice wouldn't knock. It would kick the damn door down. The ride back to Oak Ridge was dark, quiet, and humming with purpose. Caleb didn't listen to music. He didn't make a call. The hum of the tires and the low growl of the engine were enough to keep his mind in motion. The roads he once knew like the back of his hand had changed. Some new signs, a different gas station. But the feeling, that old weight pressing down on the chest, that hadn't gone anywhere. As he approached Pineview Lane again, the sun had barely started to rise. The blue light of morning peeled over the treetops like a silent wave. He didn't drive all the way to the house, parked 3 blocks down, stepped out without slamming the door, and walked the rest. His boots on the pavement barely made a sound, but inside him a storm was already gathering. He reached the porch, stood for a second, and stared at the spot where his father's blood had dried into the wood grain. The dent in the mailbox was still there, still unpatched, like a scar nobody had the nerve to cover. Caleb didn't knock. He opened the door and stepped in like he never left. Eli was in the kitchen, same old wooden chair, same coffee mug chipped at the lip, a fresh bandage above his right eyebrow. His eyes flicked up, didn't widen, didn't smile, just nodded. "You came," he said, voice gravel and smoke. "You called," Caleb replied, stepping closer. "They hurt you bad?" "I've had worse," Eli said. But Caleb could see it, the bruising in his movements, the tight breaths he tried to hide. And worse than the wounds, that familiar flicker of disappointment in his eyes, the kind that says, "I knew they'd come for me. I just didn't know it'd be now." Caleb didn't waste time. He pulled out a flash drive from his jacket, plugged it into his old laptop, and began sifting through audio clips, internal communications from the Oak Ridge PD he'd intercepted, records scrubbed from the server just hours after his father's arrest. "They're trying to bury it," Kailan said. "They know what they did. But they think if they move fast enough, it won't matter." Eli didn't reply, just looked out the window toward the trees. "They don't think I'll fight back," he finally muttered. Well, they're not wrong, Caleb answered, but I will. He laid out the plan like a mission briefing. Exposed patrol logs, falsified charges, body cam footage that conveniently cut off 5 minutes too soon. A judge already in too deep and a sheriff with one hand in the town budget and the other on a bottle of bourbon. They've got 3 layers of protection, Caleb said, pointing to the whiteboard he'd hung in the dining room. Politics, paperwork, and fear. Eli exhaled slow. Fear's always the strongest of the 3. Not anymore, Caleb replied. Not when we've got proof. He'd already set up shop in an abandoned auto garage 3 blocks from the courthouse. Old Mr. Luther's place. Forgotten, dusty, and completely off the radar. He rigged it with routers, planted sound mics around the station, even tapped into the courthouse security feed. Nobody in Oak Ridge had a clue. Yet. But this wasn't just surveillance. It was a message. He was building a fuse long enough to light the whole machine. Late that night, as Eli rested in the recliner, Caleb stepped outside with a headset, patching into the live stream from the alley behind the precinct. 2 officers, laughing in low voices, joked about old Eli and how they put him in his place. That was the moment. Caleb recorded the audio, filtered the background, then pulled up the matching video from the body cam logs, footage they thought was deleted. It wasn't. He had it all. He clipped it, stamped a timestamp, and uploaded it to 3 separate encrypted drives. This isn't vengeance, Caleb said softly to himself, watching the progress bar tick upward. This is insurance. The next morning the town didn't know what hit it. A video dropped at 7:01 IEM sharp, anonymous, clear, raw. It showed Briggs smirking as he yanked Eli to the ground, Lane kicking over his toolbox like it was trash, no soundbite, no commentary, just the truth. Unfiltered. By 8:15, it had 10,000 views. By 9, local pastors were calling for accountability. By noon, Channel 5 was parked outside the courthouse. The people who knew Eli, the kids he fixed bikes for, the neighbors he helped during storms, began to show up, not in anger, not yet, in silence, with signs, with steady hands, with voices that trembled but didn't break. Caleb watched from the shadows, watched as the mayor's assistant peeked out the second-floor window, watched as officers stepped outside the station one by one, squinting against the daylight like they'd never seen truth in the sun. He knew it wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start. That night he knelt beside his father, who was resting again, and whispered, "You're not going down as just another story they cover up. You're the beginning of something." And Eli, eyes closed, whispered back, "Then don't stop halfway." Caleb didn't. He never planned to. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting a warm glow across the modest kitchen where Emily sat, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The events of the past weeks had left her weary, but a newfound determination flickered in her eyes. Across from her, Detective Harris reviewed the notes from their previous conversations, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Emily," he began, his voice steady, "we've made significant progress, but there's still more to uncover. Are you ready to continue?" She nodded, setting her mug down with a soft clink. "Yes, I need to see this through." Their investigation had led them to a series of abandoned warehouses on the outskirts of town, rumored to be the meeting place for the clandestine group they were pursuing. As they approached the dilapidated structures, the air grew thick with tension. Inside, the warehouses were a maze of shadows and echoes. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that pierced through the broken windows. Emily's footsteps echoed as she navigated the labyrinthine corridors, her senses heightened. Suddenly, a faint sound caught her attention. A whisper of movement, barely audible. She signaled to Harris, and they moved cautiously toward the source. Turning a corner, they discovered a hidden room, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the room was filled with documents, photographs, and maps pinned to the walls. It was a treasure trove of information, detailing the group's activities and connections. Emily's eyes scanned the materials. her heart pounding as she recognized familiar faces and locations. "This is it," Harris whispered. "This is the evidence we need." As they gathered the documents, a noise behind them caused them to freeze. The door creaked open and a figure stepped into the room. It was a man, his face obscured by shadows, but his presence exuded authority. "I see you've found our little archive," he said, his voice calm yet menacing. Emily stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "We're putting an end to this." The man chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "You think you can stop us? This operation is bigger than you can imagine." Harris drew his weapon, aiming it steadily. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The standoff was tense, the air charged with anticipation. Suddenly the man lunged, and a struggle ensued. Emily and Harris fought valiantly, their determination fueling their actions. After a fierce confrontation, they subdued the man, securing him with makeshift restraints. With the evidence and the apprehended suspect, they returned to the police station. The information they had uncovered led to a series of arrests, dismantling the group's network and bringing justice to those affected by their actions. In the days that followed, Emily found solace in the knowledge that their efforts had made a difference. The town began to heal, the shadows that had loomed over it dissipating with each passing day. As she stood on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky with hues of orange and pink, Emily felt a sense of closure. The journey had been arduous, but it had led to a brighter future, for her and for the community she called home. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the townspeople of Magnolia Ridge filled the pews, their murmurs echoing off the high ceilings. The air was thick with a mixture of hope and apprehension. At the front, Judge Thompson adjusted his glasses, his gaze stern as he surveyed the room. Caleb sat beside his father, Eli, who bore the bruises of his ordeal with quiet dignity. The evidence they had gathered was irrefutable, and today justice would finally be served. As the proceedings began, the prosecution presented the damning footage. The officers' unwarranted aggression, their blatant disregard for protocol, and their attempts to cover up their misconduct. Gasps rippled through the audience as the truth unfolded on the screen. The defense attempted to deflect blame, citing procedural errors and miscommunication, but their arguments faltered under the weight of the evidence. The jury, composed of townspeople who had known Eli for decades, listened intently, their expressions a mix of shock and resolve. After hours of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in applause, tears streaming down faces as the community embraced the long overdue justice. Outside, the sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the courthouse steps where Eli and Caleb stood, surrounded by supporters. Reporters clamored for statements, but Eli raised his hand, signaling for silence. "I appreciate the support," he began, his voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I did. It's about holding those in power accountable and striving for a better future." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices united in a chorus of solidarity. In the days that followed, reforms were implemented within the police department. Officers underwent rigorous training on bias and de-escalation techniques. Community oversight committees were established to ensure transparency and accountability. Eli returned to his daily routines, his spirit unbroken. He continued to serve his neighbors, his presence a testament to resilience and integrity. Caleb, inspired by his father's strength, pursued a career in law, determined to advocate for those without a voice. The events in Magnolia Ridge served as a catalyst for change, sparking conversations and reforms in neighboring towns. Eli's story became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, justice could prevail. As the sun set over the town, casting golden hues across the landscape, Eli sat on his porch, a contented smile on his face. The journey had been arduous, but the destination, a community united in justice and compassion, was worth every step. When the dust finally settled over Magnolia Ridge, it wasn't the sirens or speeches that stayed with people, it was the silence, the kind that follows a storm. Not because nothing's left, but because everything's changed. Eli Thompson's fight wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about reclaiming the right to exist with dignity, without having to prove he belonged on the porch he built with his own hands. For years, Elliot carried his service like a quiet badge, never asking for special treatment, just respect. But when that respect was stripped away, when he was thrown down and cuffed on his own front lawn, the town saw what some had ignored for decades. It wasn't just one man, it was a system. One that smiled at veterans and neighbors in daylight, but sharpened its knives when no one was looking. And it was his son Caleb who lit the match, not with fire, but with evidence, with truth, and with relentless precision. Caleb didn't come home for revenge. He came back to pull every crooked thread out of the town's fabric and show the world exactly what had been woven in the dark. In the end, it wasn't about Eli being a war hero. It wasn't even about him being right. It was about a town finally facing its reflection and deciding whether to fix what was broken or keep pretending the cracks weren't there. The real legacy of this story isn't just that justice was served, it's that people paid attention. They listened, they marched, they changed policies, and maybe most importantly, they remembered. Because every neighbor who once turned their head learned that silence has a cost. And every young person watching saw what strength really looks like. It's not loud, it's not angry, it's steady. It's standing your ground when the world tells you to sit down. So if you're still here, if this story touched you, then don't let it end here. Justice isn't a destination. It's a choice we make every single day. And now, I want to hear from you. If this video moved you, if you believe Eli's fight matters, comment 1 below. If not, hit 0 and tell me why, so I can make these stories stronger, deeper, more real. Because your voice matters, your feedback matters, and together, we're building something louder than silence. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to remember that quiet doesn't mean weak and that dignity is worth defending. Thanks for watching. Stay strong, stay human, and most of all, stay standing.